Hi guys and welcome back. Today I wanted to talk a bit specifically about one of my favorite things to paint, and that's texture on skin. I love how it instantly adds more life and character and interest to the characters that I paint, and it's usually one of the very last steps, so it's just fun to be able to get to that point and then add all those little finishing touches. So first off, I just want to show some quick examples of the first three ways that I like to add texture. These are usually in most of my pieces in some way or another. So the first technique is where I just add a very fine speckling of texture. This just adds that texture really quickly, and it often, if you do it right, can be really fine, but it also has a mixture of different size dots, and this looks great for freckles, or it also just feels like general skin texture. Personally, I like to use a flat brush for this, and then I just run my finger along those bristles. I find that this is really easy to control what size of little dots I get. The more you play with it, the more you'll realize what kind of pressure gets what kind of results. And it does allow quite a bit, like I said, control over getting really fine, tiny dots, and some areas that end up being a little bit larger, which adds variety to it. And that's what's great about it, is that it quickly adds lots of variety, lots of little dots and textures very quickly. And then the second texture is actually just basically an extension of the first one, except this is manually adding in those dots. I like to use both of these in combination because this allows me to fill in any areas that didn't quite get the right variety on the face, and then I can just very carefully and specifically add in those details. It also allows me to add in larger freckles and little dots to the face so that there's a little bit more intentionality behind it and it feels a little bit more purposeful. And I love this final step of finishing up just those like freckle textures, of being able to just go in and choose where those final little elements are going to be. I prefer to use a really tiny liner brush for this. This allows me to build up larger dots, but also to be able to control it and get very tiny ones as well. And the last technique is going in and adding some little scratches. I love doing this on characters. I love the idea of adding just a little bit of ruggedness to them and a little bit more story, like they've gone through an adventure. But oftentimes I'll have pieces where I'll have more significant scratches or cuts, and then I'll build it up a lot more. But usually I'll go in and add just a little touch of this on most of them. And this is created using the same brush that I did in the last step. It's just a really tiny, very thin liner brush. This is what I use for doing line work in my watercolors as well. But I usually just start with that initial center little scratch line where I can very carefully place it, and then I build up around it where I add more little hatchings around it where there might be more irritation and rawness of the skin. And that just allows it so that there's a little bit more concentration of that extra red raw color of the skin more towards the center, and then it fades out a bit more as it gets farther away from that point. And we can just jump into the painting for today. So like I mentioned earlier, these skin techniques, these textures that I add, I always leave that till the very end, or at least after I've completely finished the rest of the skin. That way I don't end up smearing it or diffusing it with another layer on top of it. I want those details to be as crisp and clean as possible, so I'll leave those till the very end. So at the very end of this piece, we'll get back to those techniques that I've used, and we can see it in an actual painting and the way that I actually like to incorporate it. And when I'm painting with watercolors, I tend to like to go for more saturated rather than less, because I find that there's definitely a limit to how saturated you can make your colors in watercolors. So I like to be able to reach for as high as possible because I like those more punchy, bright colors. When it comes to skin, two of my favorite colors to mix together is quinacridone red, or quinacridone rose, and quinacridone gold. Those two create this really vibrant and lively kind of a skin color. But today I actually decided to make it just a little bit more subdued, a little bit more realistic in the level of saturation of the skin. So I actually reached for my maroon perylene color, which I think is really a beautiful red color to use in skin because it is a little bit more desaturated, and it works really nicely for those little scratch cut details that I did at the beginning. I almost always reach for this color specifically because even if I've done a skin color where the red is actually based on one of those much more saturated, bright, candy colored reds, the quinacridone red and quinacridone rose, I find that I still reach for the maroon perylene because it does have a little bit more of that raw, almost blood colored red. So it works really well for skin that I want to look a little bit more roughed up or scratched or sore. It works really well. I love this color for that. And I love using quinacridone violet for shadows and skin. It's a little bit more of a warm purple color, but it's also, I find that that one is actually just a little bit desaturated. It's not terribly bright, and I think that it works really nicely with a lot of colors that I use for skin. But lately I've actually been reaching for that same color that I've used to establish the base layer of the skin, where I can apply some lighter shadows and just place down those basic shadow shapes first. I really like this technique because it allows me to build up the shadows a little bit more carefully than I used to, and it adds a lot more subtlety to the shifts and changes of the planes of the face. So I actually just go in with that exact same mixture that I used for that base skin color. I don't mix any more of it. I don't let it get any more condensed so that it ends up being more potent. It just, because it's layered doubly instead of just that single layer, it does end up adding more value to it so that it is a little bit darker, so that I can get those much more soft shadow shapes. I love this technique. I think that it just creates a little bit more of a luminous face rather than the more stiffly shaded options that I used to have, where I just went right in with a darker shadow and just blocked those in, and that was done. And then it's time to start working on the hair. I did this in kind of a weird way where, looking back, I would have done it differently. I intended to block out different sections so that sections of her hair would be more of a yellow warm green and other sections would lean a little bit more on the cool blue-green side. But in the end, it didn't end up having really that strong of an effect. I just ended up making the amount of time that it took to get this base layer of hair down way longer. So I wish I had just gone in and painted all of her hair in one go, but had used more of a wet on wet technique where I could block in some areas that would end up being warmer or cooler and just let the watercolors have done its job. I think it would have ended up looking a lot more interesting, and it would have been a lot faster. And in the end, I went with much more of this contrasted approach for painting her hair, where the midtones and the light values ended up being all very light, and then the shadows that were there were very dark, and then the line work was also very dark. And I actually liked it. I think that it ended up looking very graphic and sharp. It wasn't really what I had in mind when I started painting her hair. I think I was just a little distracted while I was working on it, but I like how it turned out. I liked the process, and I enjoyed that it was something a bit different from how I normally go about painting hair. And I do think it ends up looking a little bit more unique and different from what I normally do, which is fun. It's fun to test things out a little bit like that and end up with a different result. And now it's time to get back to the textures in the skin. Again, like I said, this is one of my absolute favorite things to do. I love adding this detail. It's really fun to be able to just watch as the character becomes just a little bit more lifelike, and it adds a bit more character and history to them. So first off, I just carefully cover up some certain areas where I don't want the splatter to get. That's in her hair, on her eyes. And I start off blocking out more areas than I need to, and then I'll just shift it around as I add some of these little speckly freckle textures to her face. Mostly I focus them around the tops of the cheekbones, on the nose, a little bit on the forehead. So you want it to focus usually about where the face gets the most amount of sun, and that's on the high points. I also like to go in and specifically add more freckles to the sides of the nose, because we're looking at it at a foreshortened angle, so it's actually going to condense how many freckles you're looking at. So it'll look like there's more in that space than there necessarily is, because it, again, is condensing them all together. It looks like there's more texture there. I really like adding that little detail. I think it adds a lot more form to it, because that is a natural detail that you'll notice if you're looking at a normal human person. And now it's time to add my favorite texture, and that is little scratches. For the major ones, I like to plan those out in the sketch phase, like the little X on her cheek and some of the bigger scratches. I also always make sure that when it comes time to putting it down on the actual face, I have a scrap piece of paper and I'll test out how potent that more red skin color is. I usually want it to feel a little bit more subtle, like it's a healed scratch or it's mostly healed. So I want it to be on the lighter side relative to the skin value. So I don't want it to be a super bright red scratch unless that was specifically planned out from the beginning. So I do like to lean more on the side of a little bit more subtle. And I do have this little original painting available at my shop. There's a link down in the description that'll take you right over there if you want to check that out. This is a great chance to get a little affordable original from me. And I do want to give a huge thank you to all of my patrons over on Patreon. You guys are incredible. I can't thank you enough for the support that you show me. I do have a link down to my Patreon in the description below, so if you wanted to go check that out, that is there. And that's it for today, so I'll be back with some more art content next time. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you then.